Before we get into today's stories, visit dreadsarmy.com to sign up for the Dread Weekly newsletter so you don't miss out on any updates. Also, check out all of the channels in the Dread Network on dreadsarmy.com or in the description below. Thanks for listening. Now let's get to the stories. As a Yellowstone park ranger, I was often out on routine hikes as part of my job duties. These hikes were meant to help me familiarize myself with the park's trails and to keep an eye out for any potential hazards or issues that might need to be addressed. It was also an opportunity for me to observe and interact with the park's wildlife, as well as educate visitors about the importance of preserving and protecting the natural environment. On this particular day, I was out on a routine hike because it was part of my regular patrol schedule. I was walking along this narrow trail that led through a dense forest when I heard this rustling in the underbrush. I stopped and listened carefully, trying to determine what was causing that noise. It sounded like it was getting closer, so I slowly reached for my bear spray just in case. Suddenly, a massive creature burst out of the trees and onto the trail in front of me. It was a wolf, but unlike any wolf I'd ever seen before. This wolf was standing on two legs like a human and towering over me. It had this dark brown fur that was shining in the sunlight. Its eyes were piercing and they looked intelligent. Its jaws were strong and powerful, filled with sharp teeth that were bared in a snarl. Its claws were extended, ready to attack, and it seemed to be sizing me up, as if it was trying to decide whether or not to attack. Overall, the wolf had this intimidating and aggressive presence, and I could tell that it was a formidable predator. I froze, unsure what to do. The wolf seemed to be sizing me up. Its eyes narrowed and its lips pulled back in a snarl. It was clearly agitated. I could see that it was ready to attack. I slowly backed away, trying to keep my distance from the wolf. But it was no use. It was too fast. It just lunged at me, its sharp teeth bared and its claws extended. I tried to fend it off with my bear spray, but the wolf was too strong. It knocked me to the ground and began to bite and claw at me, determined to bring me down. I fought for my life, trying to escape from the wolf's grasp, but it was no use. It was just too powerful. I was certain it was going to kill me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Just when I thought it was all over, the wolf suddenly stopped attacking. It looked right at me with its piercing gaze, then turned off and ran into the forest, disappearing into the trees. I lay there on the ground, battered and bruised, but somehow alive. Honestly, it was a miracle that I had survived that encounter. I was eventually rescued by a team of rangers and rushed to the hospital, where I was treated for my injuries. The bite marks were deep and numerous, and it was clear that I had been attacked by a large predatory animal. But when I tried to tell the authorities about the strange bipedal wolf that attacked me, they dismissed my claim and insisted that it must have been a gray wolf or a bear. They even went so far as to cover up the incident, pretending that it never happened. I knew that what I had seen was real, and that the authorities were just trying to protect the reputation of the park. But I also couldn't prove it, and that I would have to live with the memory of that terrifying encounter for the rest of my life. I've thought about that moment many times since that day, and I have a few theories about why that wolf might have stopped attacking me. One possibility is that the wolf just simply lost interest in attacking me. It may have been agitated or provoked by something else, and my presence may have simply been a coincidence. Once it had satisfied its aggression, it may have just simply lost interest in me and decided to move on. Another possibility is that wolf was startled by something else. It may have heard or seen something that caused it to become distracted or frightened, and it may have decided to run away rather than continuing to attack me. Ultimately, I'll never know for certain why it stopped attacking me. It was an extraordinary and unexpected moment, and one that I'll always remember. Hi, Donovan. I'm very excited to be writing in as a fifth-generation rancher, who is also a fifth-generation skinwalker witness. My family is ranched out of New Mexico, and I've got 5 skinwalker sightings to tell you about. In 2020, I was moving cattle from New Mexico to Texas after selling part of my herd. I had one cow that was just refusing to be caught, so I went with an unconventional method of catching her. I decided to wait till she was asleep and sneak up on her with a rope. It was a little past midnight on August 4th, and I was heading out into the pasture on my ATV hunting her down. I found her asleep and standing up near the watering hole, so I parked the ATV so I could walk up on her with less noise. Just as I was getting close though, I heard something pounding in the dirt behind me. I turned and looked, and there it was. I could only really see it by the light of the moon, but it looked like a human, twisted around walking on all fours with its knees pointed backwards. It looked at me with these glowing eyes, and I jumped back, startled at the sight. I took off on foot back to my four-wheeler. I figured I'd find another way to catch the old cow. I wasn't going to spend another minute out there with that thing. The whole way out of the pasture, I could see it in my peripherals running alongside me. Fortunately, I finally did manage to get away, but when we went out after the cow the next morning, she'd been just about picked clean. All that was left were her bones, laid out bleaching in the summer sun. My mom saw the same thing on the property back in 1979. She had retired from barrel racing in the rodeo, but still enjoyed working horses, and was out running one she just broke through that same field one evening when the skinwalker chased her. Just like with me, she said it looked like a twisted human with glowing yellow eyes. She and Dad divorced not long after that because she wanted to sell the land and leave, but he refused. After all, it's a generational ranch. In 1966, my grandfather had also seen the skinwalker there. They were putting up a new barn on the northeasternmost corner of the ranch. My grandpa had stayed out late to finish up some of the interior work after the lights were finally installed. He had both barn doors open, with the breeze flowing through the middle of the barn, as it was a pretty hot summer night, and he was wanting all the fresh air he could get while hanging the stall doors. As he was working, he felt something creep up beside him, and he thought it was his dog, a German shepherd he had called Martin. He reached out to pet Martin, but he didn't feel him there, so he looked to see where he was. That's when he saw the skinwalker, in the same form me and my mom saw standing in the middle of the barn hallway staring right at him. He screamed and the skinwalker left, but Grandpa searched all over the ranch and never did find Martin. Years later, we'd find a dog skeleton laid out in the field. The bones were all broken up, like something had eaten it. In 1947, my great-grandmother Iris was hanging clothes in the backyard at the ranch when her dog Maddie went barking and howling at something over the horizon. When she looked out to see what the dog was barking at, it was a great big bear, not something a person would expect to see out here in New Mexico. She called the dogs and the kids and they ran inside, and she watched as the bear crept up closer to the house. They didn't have a telephone, so she couldn't call for help. She sent the kids to hide under their beds, and she pushed a hope chest against the door, hoping to keep the bear out. She heard the thing grunting and circling the house, pawing at the sides and scratching the glass at the windows. But she curled up in a ball and hid under the shelves in the pantry until the noise stopped and it left. Afterwards, when her husband got home, they took a walk outside together to check on the damage. There wasn't a whole lot, but they found something even more startling. At one point while circling the house, the bear's footprints began to change. By the time it left the homestead and took off back over the hill, the bear's prints had turned into almost human-like tracks, with elongated fingers and toes, and a sharp claw poking holes in the ground at the end of each. The first reported sighting of a skinwalker in my family, though, was when my great-grandfather first bought the land in 1919. He saw it many times. He built the original house by hand and camped out in a tent on the land every night until the house was built. In his journal, he wrote about the skinwalker circling his camp often at night, watching the glow of the fire from a distance. He made peace with the skinwalker by leaving offerings of meat out for it at the top of the hill at the end of the valley. And every time the ranch has changed hands throughout its years, it comes with a warning about the skinwalker being there. Now, after what happened with the cow, my family is wanting to leave, but it's a generational ranch. Just like my dad, I can't bring myself to give it up so easily. All I can do is teach my kids about the skinwalker that lives here and how to protect themselves when it's their turn to face it down. I never used to believe that our dreams meant anything. I always thought people who kept dream diaries or who tried to apply hidden meanings to them were a bit on the crazy side. But I'm not sure how I feel anymore. About 10 years ago, my family was going through a personal crisis. I was about 25 at the time, and my younger brother was utterly possessed by drug addiction. He had been arrested a few times and even stole from my parents and from other family members. My mother refused to kick him out of the house, but she made him attend this 60-day inpatient rehab in the city. I had a friend who worked there, and she promised to keep an eye on him. The first few weeks were great, and my brother started gaining weight and would even laugh and joke around with us when we went to visit on Sundays. There was still a lot of hurt to mend, but that could wait for the future. We were all feeling hopeful and just wanted my brother to be okay. Right around the third week my brother had been in rehab, I started having kind of a reoccurring dream. A man I have never met nor remember seeing would be walking down the street. He had shoulder-length curly brown hair and these green eyes behind a pair of thick-rimmed glasses. His mouth was always in sort of a semi-smile, but not a smirk, almost like he was completely content with wherever he was in the world. Even though he was only walking, I could never catch up to him. After a while, he would always turn and look at me, and then that's it. I would wake up every time he would look at me. Like I said, I didn't really buy into any of that spiritual stuff and just figured out he was some guy in a TV show I watched or that I just can't remember. After about a week of having these dreams, I got a call from my friend down at the rehab. She told me that in the middle of the night, my brother had signed himself out. He wasn't court-ordered, and my parents, against my advice, had left a little cash with him in case he needed toiletries or something. I had a good idea of where he was going: Kensington, North Philadelphia. It's an incredibly open-air market for what he wanted. I considered leaving him to his fate, but he was my brother, and despite how angry and hurt I was, I loved him, so I went looking for him. I had a picture of him, but I didn't really think it would be of any use. Still, I tried. I walked around for hours showing the pictures to passerbys and pretty much waiting to get beat up or robbed at any moment. I walked for hours and hours. It was getting late, and as desperate as I was, I knew that staying after dark would be guaranteed trouble. I started heading back towards the bus stop when I thought I recognized someone standing at the end of the street. It was the man from my dreams. He stared at me for a few seconds with that slight smile on his face, and then he turned and walked around the corner. I sprinted to catch up to him, momentarily forgetting about my brother. When I rounded the corner, I saw that he was already at the next block and turning again. There was no way, not even if I ran, that he could have made it that far. I kept running after him. Some of the other people on the sidewalk were yelling curses at me. We played that cat and mouse game for several blocks, and he turned a few more times. Finally, as I came speeding around another corner, I saw him standing in front of an alleyway. He turned to look at me, and then he walked down it. I trotted over to the head of the alley and peered down. The alley ended in this dead-end brick wall, and the guy was nowhere to be seen. Only a bunch of garbage and a dumpster. And that's when I noticed a pair of legs sticking out from behind the dumpster. Thinking it was the guy, I rushed over with a balled fist. But it was my brother. He was unconscious. I tried to slap him awake, but he wasn't responding. I pulled out my phone and called 911. Due to the sheer number of overdoses in the area, there were a lot of emergency response teams nearby. They got there in a few minutes and shot my brother full of Narcan and rushed him to the hospital. He survived, and not only that, The incident was enough to actually knock some sense into him. He's still clean to this day and owns a successful landscaping business. I wouldn't dream about the man for another 10 years. I became a dad recently to a little baby boy. The pregnancy was pretty rough on my wife, and we had a few scares, but in the end, we were blessed with the new addition to our family. Sleep, when it came, was restless, and over the last 2 weeks, I started dreaming about that man again. This time, he was just standing there, right in front of me, but at a weird angle, almost like I was looking up at him. No matter what I did, I couldn't touch him, and I would always wake up after a while. I chalked it up to bad sleeping or being too preoccupied with my son to give it any real thought. When my son was about 2 months old, my wife was finally starting to feel like her old self again. We had just laid the baby down for a nap, and my wife wanted to go visit her sister a few minutes away before the baby woke up again and was hungry. She deserved a little time to herself, and I wanted to trim some of the hedges out back, which was going to take 20 minutes tops. I had headphones on connected to the baby monitor, as well as an app on my phone that was connected to video. I could see and hear everything in the room. I was outside, my back turned to the house. I was almost done, maybe about another 10 minutes when I pulled out my phone to check on my son. There was someone standing next to his crib, staring right into the baby camera. It was the man. The same man from the day that I found my brother. In a full panic, I rushed into the house and right into the bedroom. I looked around quickly and I couldn't see him anywhere. Our house isn't that big. It's a single-story ranch. It only took a few seconds to check every other room. I went back into the bedroom to check on the baby, and my gut just dropped to the floor. Somehow, my little boy had wiggled around in his swaddle, and it had come up higher than it should, covering his mouth and nose. I couldn't see it from the camera angle. I frantically pulled it down to his chin and could see that his face had a slightly bluish tint to it. I pulled him out of the crib and placed him onto the bed, while simultaneously calling 911 from my cell phone. The person on the phone walked me through what to do while the paramedics came. But even as I followed her steps, my son's color started to return to normal and he was breathing okay. The paramedics showed up a few minutes later and still thought we should take him to the hospital just to be sure. I went with the van and called my wife to tell her what happened. But I was feeling better now because my son wasn't showing any signs of distress. We got to the hospital, my wife showing up a few minutes later, and sat right outside the room while the nurses and the doctors checked him out. The doctor eventually came out and confirmed that he was just fine and no permanent damage had been done. She did tell us, however, that even a couple of minutes longer without breathing and the result could have been devastating. This happened 5 days ago, and my son is doing just fine. We got rid of all the swaddles and opted for a sleeping sack instead. I've been doing some research on this stuff. This man, or whatever he is. That's how I found your channel. And while I'm still not totally convinced, and I'm sort of starting to believe that there might be entities or spirits in the world, and not all of them are bad. So who or whatever you are, thank you. Every government institution has secrets. It comes with the territory, right? Once you're entrusted with enough power or enough responsibility, you're bound to come across some information you're not supposed to share. I've been repeating that idea like a mantra lately. Let's say I know something that could be dangerous. Is it my responsibility to share that information? Or is it my responsibility to keep it secret? I don't know the answer, but keeping the experience to myself isn't sustainable anymore. It's driving me crazy. If I never talk about it, I'll never have more than these questions. I want some answers instead. Almost 10 years ago now, the compliance office overseeing Yosemite National Park received an anonymous tip that poachers were in the area. Mariposa Grove was named a specific point of interest. If you don't already know, that's a concentrated area of the sequoia on the southernmost tip of Yosemite. The compliance office isn't usually in charge of filtering information like that. It took a while to trickle down to the right people. Once we had it, I was grouped with a team of rangers asked to monitor the grove. Under circumstances like these, most tips don't pan out. We either hear about the poachers after it's too late, or they realize that we've been tipped off, and they never show. I spotted these poachers right away. A few days after I was assigned, I found tracks of an undocumented campsite. That put me on the trail fast. It was another day before I caught up to them. In hindsight, I should have recognized how out of the ordinary this was. The tip went through the wrong office. The park district mobilized immediately. And there I was, closing in on our suspects just a few days later. As much as I hate to say it, we never acted with so much urgency. We weren't always that accurate either. The suspects were a 50-year-old man and his teenager son. They were scared even before I flashed my badge. Those should have been my last red flags. I should have listened to their story. At the time, all I heard was that they were hunting something. They admitted it. I didn't waste time on any details beyond that. They told me that they had already set up a trap in the area too. That needed to be my priority. The sun was setting. I asked them to lead me to the trap anyways. It needed to be disabled before it could do any permanent damage to the local wildlife. They begrudgingly agreed. The boy was particularly resistant. I remember him yelling at the father, almost warning him that something bad would happen if they went along with my demands. If anything, that only made me more persistent. I thought they were trying to avoid additional legal trouble. To me, that meant they were hiding something else. I wanted to see it. We walked for about a mile. When it finally got dark, I contacted my superiors over the radio. If either of the suspects were injured while I was urging them on, the park district would be facing a lawsuit. They agreed with my earlier assessment. We needed to disable the trap and ensure that the poachers weren't hiding anything else. I was expecting to find a snare or a live cage. What I found instead was a pit. They had dug a hole large enough to bury an elk. Sharpened stakes were crammed in the bottom, and a cloth sack was suspended from a tree overhead. Red liquid was leaking through the fabric. I turned and questioned the poachers. There were black bears in the area, sure, but they weren't going to be lured into a trap with a bag of raw meat. They weren't going to come running like sharks to blood. Before the father or son could answer me, a roar swept through the trees. It was deep and long-winded, louder than anything I'd heard from a bear. I must have processed the next few events in shock. I don't remember being an active participant in anything that had happened. I only remember the encounter unfolding around me. The son ran and tackled me to the ground. As he did, a flash of reddish fur leaped over our heads. I saw teeth and spit and fiery eyes. I think I climbed to my feet. I was standing for the next part. The animal charged the father. It was running on two legs. I remember that vividly. Its long arms swayed, almost scraping the ground when it sprinted. The old poacher wasn't fast enough to run away. He must have known that because he headed for the pit instead. He jumped across the opening as the animal lunged for him. I watched its snout-like mouth wrap around his shoulder. Then the two of them fell in the pit together. There was a scream and a whine. I'm not sure where either sound came from, the man or the monster. A team of first responders was in the area within an hour. They airlifted the poacher out of the spike pit and took him to a hospital for treatment. He lived. The animal did not. Whatever that creature was, it was dragged out of that hole under a blue tarp. The body was carried out of the grove on the back of a four-wheeler. I remember its limbs dangling out from underneath the sheet and cutting lines in the dirt. When we got through the trees, they were waiting for us. Another government agency. They gave their credentials to my superiors. When I tried to ask questions, they insisted that I needed more medical attention. I was stuck answering questions while they loaded the tarp and the creature into this large black van. Once they drove away, they told me what I saw. The information was almost clinical. It sounded like they had rehearsed all of their answers. It was a sick bear. The poachers had injured it in a prior exchange, which was why it was moving so strangely. The father and son, they said, were members of a notorious group of illegal hunters. I'd done the Park Service a great favor, they said. I chose to believe them. I chose to believe them for years. Each night when I couldn't sleep, I chose to believe them. Each morning when I looked at myself in the mirror, I chose to believe them. Now, I'm not so sure. I look for the whereabouts of the boy and his father. They saved my life, right? It's like they don't exist. I asked a few friends of mine who still work for the Park Service if they could find the records of that incident. There's nothing. Everything behind me has been erased. I was a passenger that night. I was a spectator. I don't want to be a spectator anymore. I want to know what that creature was. I want to know where it was taken and by who. And I want to know why those two poachers were hunting it. I really enjoy hiking. I like finding cool things on the trails. Stones, leaves, mushrooms, little pieces of bark, and even tiny insects and things like that. It helps me clear my mind to do things out in nature. So when the weather is right, or if I start feeling a bit antsy, I'll go for a stroll. It was May when we started to get a lot of rain. It's one of my favorite smells. So I'd usually hold out until I saw clouds in the sky. My friend was supposed to meet up with me that day, but they weren't feeling very well. I didn't want to sit inside, so I decided that I knew the trail enough to go out on my own. I had done it plenty of times before, going on the trail alone, and it would give me more time and space to just let my mind be free. I put on my raincoat and my boots. I grabbed my satchel so I might be able to collect some fun things, and I headed out the door. The trail wasn't a far drive. It was just a few miles from where I lived. I pulled into the parking area. I wanted to make sure that I didn't leave anything important behind, so I checked my back seats and glove compartment. I typically bring a water bottle, a flashlight, and a pocket knife, just in case. I grabbed this stuff and a compact umbrella because I had been hoping for rain. I shoved it all into my satchel and I headed onto the path. It had rained the day before, so I could still smell the wet leaves in the dirt. The ground was pretty slippery, but once you get going, you kind of get used to it. This particular trail was known for having lots of wildlife. I had seen plenty of birds, a few snakes, and some squirrels and raccoons, and once I saw a few deer. I hadn't seen anything super threatening. Well, other than the snakes. I do hate snakes, but not like a wolf or anything like that. Nobody seemed to be on the trail that day, or the day before. I didn't see any footprints in the mud. To be fair, it was rather early in the morning when I went, maybe earlier than the average person would like to go for a hike. But it didn't deter me at all. I knew the trail, like I said. The clouds were definitely getting more and more dark as I hiked. I could tell that I'd get what I'd asked for. Honestly, looking back at it all, I do regret it. I started to feel tiny raindrops fall into my hair. I took out my umbrella. It wasn't pouring yet, but you could count on it getting to that point in a matter of seconds. So I'm just soaking up the environment and the ambience when I hear this strange sound in the distance. It sort of sounded like a weird high-pitched shrieking sound. So I looked around. I thought maybe it was a deer, but I'm not a wildlife expert. It could have been something else, or it could have been nothing at all. And with the rain that started to pick up, I could have just been hearing normal noises. It was a little muffled, and it sounded a ways away from me. I didn't see anything, so I packed up my water bottle and I just continued walking. My umbrella was up, so the sound of the rain was pretty loud around my head, but I kept hearing something moving in the woods off to my right. So I'd stop and I'd look and listen. I was naive, I suppose, too trusting. I just kept brushing it off. The rain is knocking some branches around, because that's what it sounded like, branches being disturbed. There was a point when the sounds got more intrusive. I did start to panic a little. Mostly, I had a feeling like the sound was following me, so my mind started creating theories. Was there some stalker person following me? Did they know where I lived? I was scared, but I was scared of the wrong thing. I halfway expected to see a creepy person or a bear. That's not what I saw at all. As I'm looking around to identify what is making all of the ruckus, I notice to my right something moving. My focus is entirely on this one particular tree. The trunk of the tree is decently thick. and there's plenty of branches on it. But then I started to realize that some of the branches I had been looking at weren't really branches at all. They were antlers. My heart kind of relaxes. It's just a deer following me through the trees, no big deal. I take my eyes off of it. I turn backwards towards the path and take a couple of steps when I hear something behind me. Let me just say that what I had seen before was not a deer. It was now standing by the closest tree to my back in the right. It was basically on the path, but it was standing up like a human does. Its legs weren't human though. They looked more like a deer's legs with hooves. Its body almost looked like it could easily camouflage with a tree because it seemed very, frail. It looked like its limbs could have been branches because of how thin they were. It literally looked like part of the tree. The only thing that helped me realize that I wasn't looking at a tree, other than its quick movement, were its eyes that seemed to glow kind of like an animal's eyes in the dark, and the weird deer skull that it was wearing on top of its face. As quickly as it appeared, it was gone. I didn't even have time to grab my pocket knife. I don't know if I trust my eyes, if I'm being completely honest. It all happened so fast. I took a summer job a few years ago in a town by my college. A local lodge wanted a housekeeper to clean the place and keep it tidy. Not too many people came in and out during the day, but it seemed to pick up at night. I didn't mind being alone, just pop on my headphones and get to cleaning, really. The lodge was 3 stories tall with the basement. However, they never instructed me to clean down there. Part of me figured it was just storage, but by the size of the building, I could surmise that the basement was pretty large. One day I was going about my normal routine, where I cleaned the top floors and worked my way down to the bottom. When I got to the first floor, I noticed the door down to the basement was wide open. I took my headphones out and called out thinking it's possible some other staff member went down there, or even the owners. The owners would come by frequently and grab boxes and bags from the basement. I called out asking if anyone was there, but I got no response. I don't know what came over me, but my curiosity got the best of me. It's not like I was suspicious of anything down there. I just wanted to take a look. There was a narrow staircase that led you down. I think I took about 3 steps before I heard someone call me. I gasped and turned quickly to see the owner. Immediately I apologized and explained that the door was open. He chuckled a bit and said, "You're not in trouble. I'd be happy to give you a tour." He led me down the narrow staircase, and just as I suspected, the basement was huge. It wasn't your typical dark and dingy basement. To my surprise, it was super clean and well lit. A brick fireplace stood erect in the middle of the room, and boxes of holiday ornaments lay in the corner. The owner walked with me around to the corner where a vacant walk-in freezer remained. He explained that when his great-grandfather owned the building, it was once a prominent restaurant. He told me he didn't have the heart to tear any of it down when they built the lodge on top. After he was done giving me a tour, he led me upstairs. Nothing much to see down there, but it is a bit private, he said. Given what he told me about the basement and how it was essentially a shrine of the remains of his grandfather's prominent restaurant, I didn't question anything. He told me sometimes strong gusts of winds open the door, but if it ever happens again, just close it and go about my duties. I went about my task for the day, but kept recalling the layout of the basement. The first thing that struck me as odd was the fact that there were no windows in the basement or any airflow. So how could gusts of wind prompt the door open? I recalled the walk-in freezer and wonder why they didn't put that one to use. There was one smaller one on the first floor, but the size of the one in the basement would fit so much more. My shift ended at 6 p.m., and I had to put away all my cleaning supplies in the storage room on the first floor. I was on my way out when I noticed the basement door was open again. I went to close it, but I heard commotion coming from downstairs. I leaned it to see if I could hear voices, but only heard scuffling. On the off chance it was someone who wasn't supposed to be there, I didn't want to call out and alert them. I quickly and quietly tiptoed over to the supply room and grabbed a broom. It wasn't much, but it was the best weapon I had on hand. I approached the top of the spiral stairs and slowly descended. When I reached the bottom of the steps, I looked around cautiously and heard commotion coming from around the corner, where the freezer was. The closer I got, the louder it sounded. It was banging and coming from inside the freezer. I immediately opened it and stepped back, cocking my broom in the air. An elderly man burst out of the freezer gasping. "Oh, thank you. I couldn't get the door open," he said. I dropped my broom and asked if he was okay. He was wobbling a bit when I reached out to grab him. His hands were ice cold. "You're freezing," I told him, and I removed my jacket, placing it on him. He sighed in relief, thanking me while he caught his breath. I sat him down on this dusty chair and debated about turning the fireplace on. I was inspecting it, trying to flip it on, but it didn't seem to work. "Oh, I could never get that old thing to work," he said. "Customers didn't mind the cold season. I guess because the food is that good," he chuckled. I remembered the owner talking about the restaurant. "Did you work at the restaurant?" I asked. "Worked there? I owned it." He smiled and began glancing around, and his smile soon faded. "Wait a minute. Where's the tables and chairs?" he said angrily. I tried to calm him down, thinking he got confused, and was an old worker who wandered in. I sat him back down and I told him that I'd get him a glass of water. I went up to the second floor and got a water bottle, and I rushed back down into the basement. When I returned, there was no sign of him. My coat was left on the chair, but he wasn't. I looked around for a bit and figured maybe he caught his senses and left. I grabbed my coat and put away the chair and went back upstairs. I called it a night and went home. The next morning, I intended to tell the owner about the incident. When I arrived the following day, I noticed guests crowded in the lobby. Among them was the owner. When he caught sight of me, he waved me over. He apologized for forgetting to let me know that I didn't need to come in until later. I asked him why the people were gathered around, and he told me it was the anniversary of his grandfather's death. He went on about how he had passed away in this freak accident. I questioned how he passed, to which he replied that he got locked into the freezer. My stomach turned and my heart dropped. I glanced towards the basement, knowing I had encountered his grandfather. I have spent weeks listening to your channel. I have listened to so many accounts of inexplicable happenings. It has taken me a long time to work up the willpower to talk about my experience. I prefer not to bring it up often because I don't want it to be real. And I'm afraid if it happened once, it could happen again. But here I am, telling you anyway. This event took place when I had been a ranger for about a year. When I first started out, I was single and only had to think of myself. I could make just about any accommodations work. That was back in the early 2000s. I honestly never thought I would find a significant other. But then I ended up meeting just the right person, out of the blue. I was working in the Medicine Bow Rut National Forest at the time. While we were engaged, I was still living in a pretty primitive situation, so it wasn't the best setup for our social life. But we spent plenty of time together during my time off. We both loved to hike a lot, and one of our first trips together was camping in this spot we loved, a bit east of the National Forest. It was quiet and off the beaten path. It was a great place to get away from everyone and recharge. The first night we were there, it was a little stormy, so we didn't sleep that great. But the next day started off much calmer. We wanted to drive to a neighboring peak that I had heard about, so on the second morning of our trip, we headed that way. There were supposed to be several different trails and quite a few campsites in the area, but there was one trail that went to an alpine lake that we wanted to check out. We drove for about an hour to get to the place. When we got there, it seemed weird that most of the campsites were empty. I had heard that the area was usually very popular, but there were only a couple spots taken. One of the sites had an old broken down tent and seemed to be kind of trashed. The other occupied site had an old man cooking something over his fire. When we pulled up, he gave us a look like we were trespassing or something. There was an old truck and a Jeep in the parking area. We parked and started getting our stuff together. I was getting pretty weird vibes from this place, even though I heard good things about it. It seemed to have gone downhill since the last time I looked at the reviews. We went searching for the trail and finally found a path after looking around for a while. The path was easy to follow, but the switchbacks were really steep. It really gave us a workout. We made it up there and enjoyed the beautiful view and took some pictures. We hung out there for a while and had a snack and talked about our plan for the next day. When we started heading down, we got about halfway, and all of a sudden, everything got completely silent. We couldn't hear a sound. No birds, no bugs, no wind, nothing. It was a very large and abrupt, obvious change. And we felt this incredibly oppressive feeling that just surrounded and pressed in on us with this heavy force. It makes me shudder to think about it now. I somehow felt like we were being trapped, even though we were surrounded by open space. My fiance and I looked at each other, and we both had fear in our eyes. We started running downhill, but the feeling seemed to follow us. We were coming around one of the switchbacks when we heard this ungodly shriek, and then the air seemed to be filled with an immense dark shadow. It didn't seem possible, but it felt like a huge cloak was being dropped over us. Out of nowhere, I saw something flapping slowly like the wings of a giant bird, but I only got a glance at it before I must have blacked out. I don't know how to describe it except it was moving through the air in a very unusual way, and it seemed to be the source of the silence that had fallen over everything. It felt like a void of complete emptiness. I remember trying to outrun it, but knowing that it was impossible. It was probably only a few seconds before it overtook my mind and shut me down. Then we came back to our senses. We were back sitting in our car. I looked at my watch, and 4 hours have gone by, twice the length of time it would have taken us to get down the trail. I have no idea if we actually lost consciousness or somehow that our memory of those hours eradicated. My fiance and I compared the experiences. They were identical. When we woke up, we felt completely disoriented. I looked around and the same truck and Jeep were parked nearby. The old man was still sitting outside of his tent, but now he had his back to us. We just sat there in disbelief, trying to understand what had happened to us. But there was no understanding it. It was like something out of a bizarre fairy tale. I guess the only thing comforting us, if you could call it that, was that we had experienced the same thing. So we either weren't crazy or we're both completely crazy. Some of the stories I've heard on here have made me feel less alone at least. My fiance and I did end up getting married, and we still like to hike, but we have moved away from that area where that happened. I wouldn't consider going back there ever again. I was working for the United States Forest Service in the Blood Mountain Wilderness. If you don't know, that's the wilderness area in Georgia. About 10 miles of the Appalachian Trail runs through it. The wilderness area can be rugged in some parts, but we try to maintain it well for the visitors. We have a healthy population of black bears in the area, so that's a major concern. My experience happened in the late 90s. We had several reports about black bears bothering dispersed campers, despite using proper bear precautions. I did some night patrols of the area to see if I could find the bear responsible. I was driving along one of the access roads in the park when I saw something moving in a ditch. It looked like the outline of a bear. It was fixed on something in the ditch. I shined a spotlight to get a better look. I couldn't see its face, only its back, but I could see that it was eating something. It looked like a deer carcass, but I wasn't certain from that angle. I stayed in my vehicle, but I rolled down the window and tried to scare it off. Bears can be aggressive around food, and we weren't too far from an area with frequent campers. Well, I screamed, honked the horn, and waved my light around, but the animal didn't seem to notice or care. I had a signal flare in my truck. I lit it and threw it at what I thought was a large black bear. The flare hit the animal in the back, and it finally turned around. I could see it wasn't a bear at all. Its face was illuminated red by the flare that was burning at its feet. It was a wolf, a gigantic black wolf. I'm not joking when I say that it was the size of an adult black bear, maybe even larger. Its eyes were a yellowish amber color, and its teeth looked too big for its mouth, like those Ice Age creatures you read about in books. I had clearly pissed it off. It was staring right at me through the window. I honked a horn at it, but the creature didn't care. I can't tell you how fast I rolled up my window, but the animal didn't go to the driver's side window like I thought it was going to. It walked right in front of my truck. If I thought the wolf was big before, it was enormous now. It stood in front of my truck, like it dared me to hit it. It would have been like hitting an elk. I knew my truck couldn't take that kind of damage, and I think the wolf did too. I knew I had to get out of there, but it was blocking the road. I slammed the truck into reverse and spun around as quick as I could. The wolf didn't budge. I watched the entire time in my mirror, but here's the creepy part. As if seeing a giant wolf creature wasn't frightening enough. As I was driving away, I watched the wolf in my rearview mirror, and it stood up on its hind feet, just like a bear. I got back to the ranger station and locked myself inside. I called my supervisor and I told him about the wolf, and he didn't believe me. He said I must have been tired and it was probably just a bear or a stray dog. I don't blame him, but it was frustrating. The whole thing sounded absurd, but I know what I saw, and it wasn't a bear, and it wasn't just some stray dog. On my drive home that night, I was too afraid to even look out the window at the forest. I was so afraid I would see that thing's face out there. Somehow, I managed to get inside the safety of my house. I didn't sleep at all that night. I went back to the ranger station in the morning, and what I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. All around the perimeter of the station were footprints, wolf footprints to be exact, except they were the size of a bear's. It had followed me all the way back that night. I showed my supervisor the prints when I got to the station, but he accused me of playing an elaborate prank, since the prints were obviously canine-shaped, but they were entirely too large. I tried to track where the creature went, but it covered its tracks well. It was like it wanted me to see that it was there, but it didn't want me to know where it went off to. I was terrified. If that thing managed to follow me back to the station that night, it could have followed me back to my house. I don't imagine walls or locked doors could stop an animal like that if it really wanted to get in. I ended up transferring to a different area and finding an apartment nearer the city. I just couldn't sleep knowing that that thing was nearby. I never found out exactly what it was. It was just a giant wolf, or it was some sort of unknown creature. Whatever it was extremely smart. I keep thinking back to that moment in the truck. It knew I wouldn't hit it if it stood in front of me. It knew I couldn't. It managed to follow me back to the ranger station. But that's all it did. It put quite a bit of effort into scaring me, but it didn't try to attack. If it wanted me dead, it had its chance then. I don't know what to think of it. I know I never want to see it again. And you won't ever catch me anywhere near Blood Mountain, I can tell you that. We were attacked. I know that sounds ominous and a little stupid, but that's what it was. It was a siege. They hit us hard and fast, and before we knew what was happening, they were gone. I wish I could say we were in a castle. I wish I could say we were behind walls that were defendable or sturdy. We were in a mobile home. I was parked out in Arizona at the time, right on the edge of the desert. I think I was trespassing, technically. I'm sure I was on reservation land. I didn't mess with no one, and no one messed with me. It was ideal for someone in my situation, with too much social anxiety and not enough distractions. Somehow, out in the middle of nowhere, I even made a few friends. Tom and George were the closest things I had to friends anyway. That's not their real name, of course, but I promise you that their real names are just as bland. You wouldn't know that they descended straight from the natives and still lived on the land of their forefathers who fought colonization to the bitter end. Maybe they didn't have enough distractions either. Why else would they have been partying with me in a rundown mobile home? We had a nice fire going. It burned most of the night. We had a few drinks, danced around it, and George even brought over a few of his single friends. They left early. I'm glad George and Tom stuck around, although I'm not sure they'd say the same. I'm sure they wished they had left me alone out there that night. They wouldn't have had to see what I saw. They wouldn't have had to fight. It must have been 2 a.m. when we heard them, something scurrying outside of the vehicle. We were at a table inside playing a round of cards. Tom heard them first. His eyes were on the windows before we could guess why. He went outside with a baseball bat to scare away coyotes. That's what we figured they were, you know. Coyotes come around sometimes. They scram when you start getting loud. Tom could get loud too. Watching him get all animated always made George and I laugh. We followed him outside after a few moments. I remember George asking if we missed the show. When our feet hit the dirt, Tom was already quiet. But Tom didn't answer. He didn't turn back. He was staring at something on the other side of the dim fire. We looked over his shoulders to see what it was. It was a man, I think. Maybe. I think they were people. People raised by the desert. I guess people raised by wolves? The man animal was naked and crouching on the ground. We couldn't see his face through the licking flames. George yelled to scare him off, and another man creature scurried up to join the first. This one was a female. We saw her face. It was shaped like a bat or a rodent or something. Her nose split open like a blooming flower. Her teeth were awkward, and her lips were pulled back to expose a 1/4 inch of gums on the top and bottom of her mouth. If she had eyes, I didn't see them. George got quiet. I was the first one to turn tail. I wasn't sticking around to write a report for National Geographic. Tom followed, and George came in last. He locked the door. We stood there staring at it, huffing, for what must have been a full minute. Then something slammed against the door. It wasn't dull like flesh. It was hard and cracked when it hit the paneling. We found out the next morning that it was a log from the fire. They grabbed it out of there while it was still burning. Then came the stones. It sounded like hail at first, hail and howling wolves. As the creatures whooped and screamed outside, they pelted the mobile home with whatever they could find. The windows cracked, shattered. We were worried they'd be smart enough to burn us out. They weren't, or maybe they weren't trying to kill us at all. Who knows? Maybe it was just a show of strength. We fought to keep our door barricaded and the windows blocked. One of the rocks sailed in and struck George in the temple. He didn't go down, but his legs wobbled after that. Tom kept yelling back. I doubt the beasts outside spoke any of the languages that Tom did. He threatened them anyway. The things got braver, even if they didn't get smarter. Eventually, the tin-like thuds of the stones and logs was replaced by the slap of the creature's palms. They smacked the walls like they could force their way in. If they tried the door, they probably could have. An hour later, it was silent. We heard them run back to wherever they came from, back to the mystery of the desert. When we opened the door, they were gone, but the walls of my mobile home were dented and covered in dirty handprints. Mud from the desert earth, blood, and other bodily fluids streaked across the vehicle like paint. None of us spoke that morning. We cleaned up together. We washed the walls with a rag, a gallon of water, and half a bottle of vodka. We worked in absolute silence until the evidence of that night before was scrubbed from existence. We didn't want to look at it at all. We wanted to pretend it was a dream. The boys left after that. I stuck around until the sun went down, and I thought I heard noises outside, and I left right away. I had the vehicle towed. The company that grabbed it fined me for the condition of the mobile home, Apparently, it was covered in dirt again. The inside was tossed, covered in the smell of animals and excrement. I sold it as soon as I could. This is the truth, though. That's the story of what happened. When I wake up tomorrow, I'm sure I won't have the courage to talk about it again. If I can ask 3 questions, what do you think they were? Why us? And why then? Hi, Donovan. It took me a while to decide to send this in to you. I've always been skeptical of people who claim to have seen extraterrestrial things. So when I had this sighting, it made me feel so excited. I kind of felt foolish. I was not expecting it at all. I know there are some people who are looking for these kind of experiences and actually take steps to search them out. But I think it's more likely to happen when you're totally not thinking about it. I never mentioned it to my boss or my coworkers. I didn't want to be labeled as a kook, but I know when you guys read things on air, you don't use names, so I'm sending it in. The state park I work for is really one of the most beautiful places that I've ever been. It has a nice mix of beaches and trails, and you couldn't ask for a better environment to work in. It's the Emerald State Bay Park in Lake Tahoe. I don't even know if I should say the name. I wonder if that makes people flock to the area. This place already does get really crowded. I've been a park ranger for quite a few years, and this is the busiest place that I've ever worked. This experience I had happened in 2019. I had spent some summers out here with my family when I was a kid. My dad really liked to rent a boat and hang out on the water all day. So I loved this place for a long time. We would kind of alternate between here and Lake Havasu for our summer vacations. I never thought I would end up being employed here though. During summer holidays, the place can be a madhouse. I was on duty on the 4th of July that year, and it was a really crazy day with all those people. After my shift, I decided to go up to Inspiration Point to take in the fireworks show. Lake Tahoe puts on one of the best shows in the country if you ask me. I got myself some snacks and found myself a good spot to relax. I knew all the little secret areas, so I wasn't near any people. The show started off as usual and was fabulous. About halfway into it, I was looking off to the west a bit, and I saw several orange orbs start to float up toward the sky. I remember thinking something like, those must be some sort of those Chinese lanterns. Then, as I was watching them, I thought maybe they were embers from the fireworks or something, but they were incredibly bright, so that didn't really make sense since the embers would be fading. They floated up and they seemed to form into kind of a W shape. They started to look like they were remote controlled or something. At first, they had looked like bright orange lights, but once they were up high, they looked brighter and whiter and started moving around. Then, they kept going higher and started looking like stars. They obviously weren't embers, but then, sort out of the middle of that W shape, there was this craft or whatever you want to call it that zoomed down lower and flew over my head. It was too fast for my eyes to really catch what shape it was, like fast as a bullet. It was still pretty high up there, but the lights on it were brighter than anything I've ever seen. And right after it passed over, there were like these little twinkles of light all in the sky right over my head. Like right over my head, not over the lake where the show was happening. The twinkles of light started making these incredible light streaks. I was beside myself. It wasn't like any technology that I had seen before. It sounds a little crazy that I had noticed this stuff while that amazing show was going on. Maybe it was because I was used to scanning the sky almost every night. The lights were behaving in this strange fashion. I can't quite explain it, but somehow those twinkles of light suddenly burst into dozens of lights in the sky. All of a sudden, they were moving together en masse, like some kind of squadron or something. it made me feel kind of anxious. But for some reason, I was also filled with this strange exhilaration. I just sat there in amazement, unable to comprehend what I was seeing, but knowing it wasn't normal. You could see the stars steady behind them as they were moving across. Then, the dozens of lights came together and went into a triangle formation, whereas before, they were just individually flying forward. Once they formed the triangle, I noticed that they were flying left to right, up and down. It was really surreal to have this amazing fireworks show going on. And there I was, completely ignoring it and watching this inexplicable sideshow. It wasn't that high in the sky, but not unnaturally low either. But eventually, the triangle seemed to just start ascending higher and higher until I couldn't see the lights anymore. I have never seen anything like what I saw before that night. For the next few months, I kept watching the sky, trying to take notice of anything strange. But I never saw anything on that grand of a scale again. I'm sure people must think that what I was seeing was part of the show, but it absolutely was not that. I know there's some military activity not too far from here, so I don't know if it could have been connected to some testing or something like that, but I really don't think so. Anyway, I really appreciate the chance to share this here. I'd like to see something like that again, but now that I'm looking for it, it probably won't happen. It had been a long day, and a particularly weird one at that. Things at work kept seemingly disappearing, and then showing up in odd places. My computer screen kept flickering on and off. And twice I lost work before I could save it. The last thing of the day was an electric pencil sharpener not working for me. On top of that, I just felt drained. My energy level was just non-existent all day. In fact, all week. I would wake up in the middle of the night. I don't know why, but there was this feeling I kept having. I can't really explain it. I know that sounds odd, but I just can't bring it to words. Maybe dread was the closest I could relate it to. Maybe that's too cliche, I don't know. People had begun to notice how tired I was looking. Dark rings around my eyes. Eyes that were more often than not bloodshot. I'd forget things. I'd lose my temper at odd times. I was a mess, really. After work, I came home and just dropped onto the couch. I didn't have any energy to do anything, really. I turned on the TV and flipped through the channels. I didn't even have the energy for that. I just left it on something and then I began to drift off, I guess. I don't really remember. That's when it happened. I was just lying on the couch. I remember opening my eyes and feeling strange all of a sudden. My arms had goosebumps, and I had a feeling of slight panic. I tried to get up, but I couldn't. I couldn't really explain why. My body just wouldn't move for me. Suddenly, it felt like there were hands on my shoulders, and something was holding me down. I tried to move. I remember I kicked my legs a little, but this force just held me down. It felt like fingers digging into my shoulders, and I couldn't catch my breath. I swore for a second I saw the outline of a face, not details or anything, just the faint outline of a face, like these deep sunk eyes, sunken cheeks, and a mouth wide open, like it was inhaling something over me. I couldn't catch my breath. I started to really panic, and that made me move more. I started moving my shoulders and my arms, trying to push whatever it was that was on top of me. I could feel it holding me, but I couldn't feel it when I kicked up towards where it should be. Suddenly, it let go of me, and I jumped off the couch. The door to the room slammed shut. I can't explain it, but then I felt alone. I was covered in this cold sweat. I was feeling dizzy. I started to walk towards the kitchen when the TV suddenly shut off, then turned on again, the volume turning up higher and higher. I covered my ears with my hands and tried desperately to turn it down with the remote. The TV just turned off. It felt like something knocked me over. I fell to the floor and I could swear something jumped on me, pinning me down. I had this huge pressure on my chest, so much so that I couldn't breathe. I tried to get up to call out, but I couldn't. Then the room began to spin and everything went dark. That's when I woke up 3 hours later. I got my keys and ran out the door for my car. I didn't know what else to do, so I drove to the hospital. Apparently, I looked pretty bad because they took me in immediately and hooked me up to fluids and had me in a bed. 3 bags of saline and 48 hours of uninterrupted sleep, and I could feel somewhat normal again. The doctors and nurses asked what happened to me. What could I tell them? I didn't know what to say. After hours of not saying anything, that's when they had the psychiatrist come in. My story came to me immediately when that happened. It was work. I wasn't sleeping. I was overworking myself, and I was consuming too much caffeine. I tried to make it sound as normal as possible. I don't know if the doctor believed me or not. They kept me for another 3 days though. When I was released, it took me a long time to go home. I drove around for a while, went to a restaurant to eat, but I eventually made my way home. I sat there in my driveway, my hands clenched on the steering wheel, and I saw something in my house. I saw it move past the curtains. This dark silhouette that suddenly dropped out of sight. I tried to take a picture, but nothing came out on my camera phone. I left right after that. I drove 12 hours to my parents' house in Tennessee. I didn't know what else to do. I told them everything, the entire story, and prayed that I didn't sound like a crazy person. I must have though, because my father, well, I don't really know what he thought. My mother seemed to believe me, and I stayed at my parents' house for a few weeks. That was that. I was moving immediately. I don't know what happened, but I wasn't staying in that house. As soon as I could, I had it up for sale and got my stuff out as fast as possible. We moved out during the day, and I spent as little time as possible in there. Things happened to the movers and my parents as well. Things would disappear in the house. The movers felt uncomfortable, but maybe that was because they kept seeing me. I'm sure I couldn't hide my fear as well as I should have. I moved back in with my parents after that, but I keep track of the house. Eventually, it went to a married couple. Months went by and nothing seemed to happen. I still have nightmares. I still can't sleep at night that well. I don't know what happened. I can't really explain it. Nothing like that has happened to me since, and I pray that it doesn't happen again. I never believed in weird or strange stories before. I'd always say that people were making it up or something. That was until something weird happened to me. That changed my life. Now I can't help but to think there's some truth in everything people encounter. Details might not be clear, whatever, but it doesn't mean it didn't actually happen. I was riding the train into Chicago. It's a great experience, it really is. And it shows you how people used to travel back before the invention of cars. People make fun of me for how much longer it takes, but it's just the experience of it. There's always a few interesting people in the train as well. I spent many hours drawing the different people sitting on the train. It's a great exercise for anyone who's into the arts, and great practice drawing people in motion, learning anatomy. I also like to look out the window at the different stops the train makes. During one of these stops, I was looking out the window, kinda daydreaming and not really paying attention to anything. Something or someone moved and caught my eye, and I turned my head to see this girl. She was alone. No one was standing around her. Her back was turned to me with this long blonde hair that almost reached the small of her back. I didn't really think anything of it, and the train eventually went on its way. I began doodling, not really drawing anything, just making shapes and scribbles. 2 stops later, I swear I see that same girl. Long blonde hair, arms wrapped around a book held to her chest, standing there alone. This time, she turns her head slowly and looks right at me. Her eyes are solid black, shiny, almost like precious stones. Her face was expressionless. and she just stared at me until the train started up again. I thought maybe I didn't get enough sleep, maybe I saw it wrong, or I was just imagining it because I'd been daydreaming on and off. Like when you get super bored sometimes, and you swear you saw something this way or you picked up something from the store, but you actually didn't. I just kept telling myself that until we made the next stop. She was there again. This time people were walking past her, but it seemed like they didn't notice she was there. She looked right at me, eyes big and black, but it almost seemed like she was looking through me. This time, she got on the train. I panicked a little, dropping my pencil, my hand shaking a little. I bent down to get my pencil from the floor, then just waited. Something told me she would end up in my train car. I sat in my seat waiting, sweating, my hands shaking every time I tried to draw. I looked around from time to time, but I didn't see the girl. I just stared out the window, trying to take my mind off what I had seen. I started to calm myself down a bit. An hour went by without me really noticing. I don't know why, but I began to look around at the people sitting around me. Far off at the opposite end from where I was sitting, I saw the top of a blonde head. The hair looked like it was straight. It looked like it could be that girl that I had seen at the other stops with the black eyes. I closed my sketchbook. I slid the pen into the metal rings that bound it and just started tapping my foot. Panic began to swell up inside me. Looking out the window wasn't working anymore, so I got up to find the restroom. When I walked back to my seat, she wasn't there anymore. The blonde head wasn't in the seat that I saw her in. I sat back down in my own seat and kept looking over from time to time. A half an hour went by and she didn't return. Then an hour, she still wasn't in that seat. Was my mind playing tricks on me? Was she even really there at all? Time seemed to fly by. Eventually, we made our way into Chicago. When I got up from my seat, I could have sworn someone touched my hair. I looked around, but there was no one near me enough to do that. I kept my eyes open as we got off the train, and as I made my way through the station, I called an Uber to bring me to my friend's house in Canaryville. I didn't have to wait long for the Uber, but I kept looking around trying to see that girl again. The Uber driver made small talk. He was a nice enough guy, but I just wanted to get to my friend's house as fast as possible. I still couldn't wrap my head around what had happened on that train. I looked out the window as Chicago passed by, taking in the city and the people. We get to my friend's and I pay the Uber. I get out of the car and I feel this cold chill run down my spine. I turn around and there she is across the street, her black eyes staring straight at me, and her blonde hair blowing in the wind. I run up to my friend's door and knock as fast as I can. He pulls it open. I almost jump inside his house. I point across the street and tell him what happened on the train. He looks across the street and his face turns white. He sees her standing there. His mouth almost drops to the floor. She turns her head and nods towards us, then just disappears when a car drives by. We both lose it, and we go out of the house looking around for her. The neighbors are looking at us like we're insane. My friend goes and asks if anyone saw the girl standing across the street. One of them did, but didn't understand why we were acting so crazy. We stayed up all night talking about it with some of our other friends. We kept looking outside, waiting to see if this girl would show up again across the street. I spent the last 17 years on the police force in various towns in Arizona and Nevada. I've got family in that area, so I never ventured too far away from home, even for a better paying job. I've seen a lot of things over the years, but there is one incident that stuck with me, one that I can't explain. I was working in a smaller town near Kofa Wildlife Refuge. It was about a 2 hours drive from Phoenix. Most of the towns around that area tend to be smaller and for the most part quieter. I had just spent the last 8 years working in the suburbs of Phoenix, and I was ready for something a little less crazy. But sometimes the desert can be a strange place when you stray from the more populated areas. I received 3 calls on one day regarding some type of property damage with unknown causes. It was the absolute dead of summer. You could fry an egg on the sidewalk at noon. Growing up in the desert, you'd think I'd be used to the heat. But there are days when it's just brutal and there's no way around it. All of my calls claimed the damage was done overnight. One was from the owner of a goat farm. The other was from an elderly woman living in an old 1970s-style trailer. And the final call was from the township. Now, property damage isn't usually an urgent matter. Oftentimes, there's nothing we can really do besides file a report. But I didn't have anything else on my agenda that day. So I set to work checking out the complaints. All of the locations were within a 15-mile radius, but the town hall was just around the corner, so I headed there first. There was already a crew of workers there when I arrived at 7:30 a.m. The water tower had somehow been punctured. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. It looked like there were claw marks down the side of the tank. I climbed the ladder to get a closer look, thinking I could find some explanations if I saw the damage up close. It looked like something straight out of Jurassic Park. Let me tell you, water towers these days are either made of steel or concrete, or both. I could fire my gun at one, and the bullet would bounce right back at me. There was no way they could be claw marks, despite what they looked like. Upon closer investigation, I found what looked like to be traces of blood along the scrapes. I took samples to send out to the lab, but I knew it would be a while before we got any results. I didn't have any reasonable explanation for the damage to the tower. I assumed it was made by some heavy machinery to be able to break through the tank, but I didn't know what could have done it, or why no one nearby saw or heard anything during the night. At a complete loss, I headed to my next destination, the goat farm. When I got there, the farmer said that at least 8 of his goats were missing. They showed me damage to the fence where it appeared someone had broken through. He thought it was most likely an animal, because a person stealing goats would have just gone through the gate. The fence was only damaged in one area. I didn't notice the correlation, but hindsight is 20/20. The broken fence was next to the water though. The water trough itself had been tipped over and moved farther into the paddock. Again, there wasn't anything I could do about the situation, besides file a report. I saved the woman in the trailer for last. I had dealings with her before, and she was always a little bit off. But what else do you expect from a woman living alone in the desert with nothing besides her dilapidated trailer and a tank of exotic fish? I hoped to make the visit as quick as possible and get back to the station. She was ranting and raving at me before I even exited my vehicle. She was barely coherent, but I did catch a few phrases like flying lizard and dragon. I was rethinking my line of work. Sometimes I don't get paid enough for this. I finally got her to calm down and try to explain what was going on. Her story was that some creature, she described it as a lizard with wings, attacked her trailer at night. She said it was nearly the size of the trailer and had claws bigger than her head. Naturally, I didn't believe a single word of it. I assumed she had been on drugs, although she didn't display any typical signs. But then she said something that made my blood run cold. She said the creature tore the water tank off her trailer. I thought back to the water tower and the goat farmer. It was then that I remembered the water tank had been tipped over and thrown around. For whatever reason, this thing was after water. She said the creature tried to break in through her window when it saw her fish. She was convinced it was going to eat them. So she cracked open the door and fired 3 shots at the beast from her 870. She claims to have hit it, but that it still flew away. I didn't know what to make of her story. I still had a hard time believing it, but I couldn't deny the connection between the 3 incidents. Something was out there looking for water, and judging by the state of the water tower, that something was certainly capable of extreme strength. But like the last 2 complaints, there wasn't really anything else I could do except file a report. I did search for blood in the area surrounding the old lady's trailer, but I found nothing. It was nearly a month before the results of the blood from the tower came back from the lab. There wasn't much to go on, but they said the blood was from a reptile, most likely a monitor lizard, but it wasn't an exact match. I don't really know how to explain what's happened, but I'll do my best. Basically, a few months ago, I made contact with something not of this earth. I lead a normal life on the North Fork of Long Island. I'm 28 and live with my girlfriend and our 2 golden retrievers. I was fortunate in my career at an early age and was able to purchase a home on the North Shore in a very secluded area, far from any neighbors. I mostly work from home and very rarely go into the office in the city. My girlfriend works the night shift, so I picked up the habit of staying up late and working through the night so we would have more time to spend together during the day. About 4 months ago, odd things began happening around my house. 3 or 4 times a week, all the electronics in my house would begin acting haywire. Lights would flicker on and off, or grow more illuminated than they should have been. My TV would turn itself on and adjust itself to a channel showing only static. I had an alarm clock radio that would filter through station after station until it too would eventually settle on pure static. Obviously, the first few times this happened, I was completely terrified. Home alone and all my electronics functioning independently was a harrowing experience. All I could think about was that a ghost or entity was inhabiting my home. Unplugging the TV and radio worked, but still the lights would flicker, and once in a while my car would remote start in the garage. But nothing ever dangerous came from it. There was never anything like the movies or scary stories about furniture being flung around, and I was never dragged feet first by any unseen entity. It kind of just kept happening, and somehow I grew accustomed to it. I mean, what else could I do? It never happened when my girlfriend was home, and I took videos on my phone a few times, but she just thought I was messing with her. After a few weeks of this, something else happened. It was a typical Wednesday night. My girlfriend would be at work for another 6 hours. As usual, right around 1 a.m., all of my electronics began to go haywire. Though it seemed to be a little more drastic this time. Web browsers were opening on my laptop at an incredible speed. First Google, then several news sites and social medias. This being a new phenomenon, I slammed it shut and manually powered it down with the side button. The lights in each room began to shine incredibly bright, and I heard a bulb shatter in the bathroom. Add to this, 2 TVs in my house were blasting that horrible static noise at full volume. This was too much for me, and I began panicking. I fled down the steps into my living room and through the back door out on my rear deck. As I flung the door open and ran outside, I felt like I was swallowed up by an incredible blue light. For a moment, I felt weightless, like I was leaving my body behind and floating into the air. Then, I didn't feel anything at all. When I regained consciousness, I could barely open my eyes due to another intense light shining down on me. It was the sun riding high in the sky. It must have been later afternoon. I could feel I was laying in the grass and my clothes were drenched in sweat. I tried rising to my feet, but I felt an intense wave of nausea and pain sweep over me. I laid a little while longer and eventually was able to stand up and get my bearings. I was in a familiar clearing, about a quarter-mile away from my house. I stumbled my way home, fighting back an expanding headache and trying not to vomit. My girlfriend must have seen me coming up the driveway, and she rushed out to help me walk. I could hear both anger and concern in her voice and allowed her to help me up the stairs into the house. Basically, I had been missing for about 12 hours. My girlfriend had tried calling several times throughout the night, and I didn't answer. When she came home, I was nowhere to be found. My cell phone, keys, and wallet all sitting at the kitchen table where I had left them. She said she made a police report, and the officers had promised to send out an APB on me, but a half day isn't a very long time to be missing for. I heard her explain all of this, but all I wanted to do was sleep. I managed to gulp down some toast and water and climbed into bed. exhausted, and still feeling ill. That sleep and every single one I've had after that was anything but restful. I have the same vision each time I fall asleep. I say vision because it isn't a dream. It's too real to be a dream. I can clearly see and hear everything each time, and it never changes. I am in a clean and sterile room with transparent walls and floors. I can't see my body or those of the people around me, but I know others are there. In front of me stands a slim, pale figure wearing some form of gray uniform covering it from head to toe, and it delivers a message. The same message every time. Only I can never recall the message upon waking, at least not all of it. I wake up with a sense of overwhelming dread each time, but for the life of me, I can't piece together what this entity is saying. I keep a journal next to my bed and write down the first thing I remember each time. So far, all I managed to piece together is 2028, gods, earth, rebirth, union, awakening. I know this all sounds so bizarre. Even my girlfriend doesn't believe me. She keeps begging me to go see a therapist, and I'm gonna go, only if to make her happy. Please, if anyone out there knows what this means or has experienced something similar, then please tell me. I want to know that I'm not alone. I had just bought my first house, and I was excited to start living a true adult life. I got a great deal on the property. It was situated on 20 acres of woodland, and the house itself had 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. It was my perfect dream home. Almost as soon as I moved out, I decided to get a dog. His name was Asher, and he was a Basset Hound rescue pup. I had been able to spend a few months in the house before things started to get weird, and it all started with Asher. I'm an avid hiker, and I love spending time in nature, which is one of the main reasons I love this house. When I was younger, I would hunt with my dad, so I know a thing or two about animal tracks. I'd been walking through the woods with Asher one day, and I noticed some weird tracks in the mud. They almost looked like handprints, which was just a weird thing to see on the ground. I didn't think much of it at the time, so I kept walking. I saw them again a few days later, much fresher looking. I knew whatever had made those tracks was still close by. What concerned me about it was that it looked like they were circling my house. Because there is so much land, I didn't have Asher on a leash. If I let him out, I could just keep an eye on him, and he'd do his business and come right back. That's how we always did it. One night, I was sitting on the couch watching TV, and Asher started scratching at the door. He looked very distressed. I assumed he might have had some GI issues and needed to leave ASAP, so I ran up and let him out. It was silent outside. No wind, no birds, nothing. Asher ran straight into the woods, which wasn't normal when I let him out. I called for him, and he didn't come back. I threw on my shoes and ran after him. I tried to listen for any signs of where he was, but I couldn't detect any noise. I'd been running for about 5 minutes, and I heard him whimpering. I booked it to where the noise was, and I saw Asher limping towards me. I knelt down to see if he was all right, and it looked like he had some scratches on his back legs, but he was having trouble walking. I heard a clicking noise and froze in place. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from exactly, but I didn't want to be there alone. It was something. I picked up Asher and started walking back to the house. All I really cared about at that moment was making sure my dog was safe and cared for, but I heard rustling behind me. It sounded like I was being followed. I quickened my pace and made it back to my house. I shut the door behind me and locked it. I looked back through the window, and all I saw was my reflection because of the light. I turned it off and looked again. In the tree line, I saw this large white thing, sort of glowing in the moonlight. It was walking along the tracks that I had seen before, the ones I thought were circling my house. I kept peering through to try to get a better look at it. I was staring at the one, and I'd seen another one pop into my field of view. This one wasn't obscured by the tree line at all. It was out in the open, walking around my yard, and it looked like it was following my tracks to the house. I ducked down and made sure my door was completely locked as I crawled across the floor. I was just hoping it couldn't see me in the dark. I crouched to the ground, and I started to hear creaking on my porch. It was slow and eerie. Honestly, it felt like it was in a horror movie. Some stuff rattled on the porch like it might have been bumped into or stepped on. When I stopped hearing noises, I slowly moved and peeked through the window. I saw it walking back to the tree line. This thing walked on all fours and was completely white. It looked almost translucent in the moonlight. I could see that it had hands, which explained the weird tracks I saw. The creepiest part of all was that it looked human. It had all of the human limbs that I could see, but it walked on all fours. I couldn't figure out what was happening. I waited until morning to go back outside. I took Asher to the vet and had them look at the scratches. After talking to them and seeing them in more detail, I think one of those things tried to grab Asher, but he was able to get away. That was the first time I encountered him. I tried not to go outside alone at night anymore. I hadn't seen them during the day at this point, so I kind of assumed they were nocturnal, but I was wrong. I was walking in my yard around 4 p.m. to take the trash cans to the curb. I was off the road a little ways, so it was a bit of a walk. On the way back, while the sun was still up, I heard the clicking noise again. I heard rustling in the bushes and I ran right back in the house. Asher was barking at the door for a good 5 minutes while I crouched down below it. I heard the footsteps on the porch again and knew it had followed me home. I feel like I'm trapped in my own house and I don't know what to do. Hey there, Donovan. I'm writing to you from Southern PA with an experience I had this fall. I think it's right up your alley. So, I'm an events coordinator and I usually work with local farms. I help them organize birthday parties, hay rides, and stuff like that. It's a pretty neat job, and I get to bring my family along to most of the public events at a discount. This fall, I took my parents to the annual apple picking bash at one of our bigger farms. They were only in town for the weekend, and I figured it would be a nice way to relax. We were in the orchard, collecting our apples and everything, when this terrible smell hit me. It's hard to describe, but it was this acidic metallic reek, and it was overwhelming. It happened so suddenly that it made my eyes water. The smell was so overpowering that it felt like it had knocked the wind out of me. I had to sit down for a second. My parents were fine and my mom asked me what was wrong. I couldn't explain it. I just felt really clammy and cold. It was hard to think. We were a little ways from the other customers. My mom ran off to get me some water while my dad stayed with me. I think we were both worried I was going to faint. My dad and I were uphill, so we could see over the rest of the orchard, and I realized that it had gotten quiet. When we looked down at the other customers, it looked like everyone had stopped moving. A lot of people were sitting down like I was, or just completely laid down on the ground. It was like we had all collapsed at the same time. I started to get really dizzy. Then my dad went down. I felt too weak to help him up. All I could do was wait it out and hope that my mom was okay. It felt like I was going to pass out at any moment. I don't know how long it lasted, but then the smell was gone. It got easier to breathe and I felt less shaky. I helped my dad up. Whatever happened seemed like it had been worse for him than it was for me. When we looked down at the orchard, we saw other people starting to move and help each other up. Whatever had affected us seemed to leave all at once. My dad and I stumbled down the hill. My mom hadn't made it very far. We found her leaning against a tree trying to catch her breath. I was worried because she had pretty bad asthma, but she seemed to be doing okay. All of us were just happy to be safe. My dad wanted to get out of the orchard as quickly as possible. The other customers had the same idea. There was this mad dash to get to the parking lot. Just a surge of freaked out people all trying to get out at once. My parents and I actually had to stay in the orchard even longer because of the crowd. By the time we finally got to our car, we were able to get on the highway. It was pretty dark out by then. I was a little nervous about driving so soon after that dizzy spell, but I didn't have much of a choice. Now, this particular orchard was about 30 miles out from my suburb. It was a little remote, and we had to travel on a few back roads before we could reach the highway. A lot of the other people were headed in that same direction, so at first I was just following the other cars. But then traffic stopped. We were stuck in the same spot for almost 20 minutes. People started getting out of their cars to walk to the front to see what was going on. Maybe a tree had fallen into the road or something. After walking for a while, I saw what was wrong. There was a barricade of police cruisers blocking the road. And not just cruisers. They had those big tank-looking vehicles, you know? The ones they'll sometimes pull out for a riot. They weren't letting anyone pass, but the police officers stayed behind the barricade. No one even came out to talk to us or direct traffic toward a different route. We were just stuck there. I asked a guy in front of me if the officers had communicated at all. He said no. I didn't want to cause a scene, so I just headed back to my car. And I gotta tell you, the longer I walked, the more freaked out I became. I had a feeling something really bad was going to happen. Or something bad already happened, and now they're just out here to clean up the loose ends. When I told my parents what I had seen, they didn't know what to do either. So we were just all waiting there, in the dark, hoping the officers would eventually get fed up and let us pass. And I guess they did. It took a while, but eventually the traffic started to move. I didn't know what changed until we got closer to the front. We each had to get out of the car, and we were asked questions by this doctor. And they split us up. I had to talk to a physician local to the area. My mom said she got interviewed by an army nurse. It took forever, and the questions were really specific. I had to remember my entire medical history on the spot. I was scared to forget anything because I didn't know what would make them keep us there longer. Eventually, they let us pass. The drive back to my house should have only taken about an hour. Instead, it was closer to 3. And by the time we got home, we were completely exhausted. No one ever came to talk to us about that mass collapse at the orchard. I don't really know what to do with this story. I feel fine, like my body didn't get affected too badly. But I think we all took part in some sort of experiment. I truly believe that. Growing up in Appalachia, you always hear stories, but you brush them off. However, the warnings that came with the stories, yeah, those you listen to. Don't whistle after dark. If you hear something saying your name, no you don't. Never run in the woods. I can go on, but these are the important ones. I had always thought these were jokes, just some old wives' tales that our moms passed down to make us listen. But that all changed a few years ago, and now I tell these warnings to everyone that says they're coming to visit. It was just another day out in the trails. I had ridden them probably 1,000 times in my life. I was checking out the fence line because we had a cow come up missing. I had been out for a few hours, but hadn't seen anywhere that the heifer could have crossed the fence. I turned my horse around and headed back, but then I heard it. I heard my name. I stopped my mare and looked over my shoulder, but there was no one there. I just kinda shrugged it off. I figured my sister was trying to play a prank on me. I would head back to the house and let Mom know that she was out there goofing off. But then I heard it again. I turned around my saddle and scanned the tree line, but I still couldn't see anyone. Sis was always afraid of the woods, so I knew that she wouldn't be further than the first trees, but I couldn't see her at all. I was starting to feel a little uneasy, so I loosened the reins and headed back again. This time when I heard my name, it was screamed. I was instantly covered in goosebumps. It sounded just like my sister, and she sounded scared. Instead of listening to my gut that was telling me to get out of there, I turned my horse around and headed to the woods. But she started tossing her head and sidestepping. She was not having any of it. I tried to calm her down, but she started to panic more. I decided that I would tie her off on a fence post and go check it out on foot. I started towards the trees. Looking back, I don't know what I was thinking, but at the time, I was trying to help my sister. It didn't take long to cross a small field and enter the woods. I started looking for her immediately, but I saw no sign of her. After a few minutes, I was ready to head back to the house, but as I started to head back to the trail on my horse, I heard the scream again. Further into the forest, I took off running, calling her name. She didn't respond, but I just kept running. I knew she was here somewhere, and this far in, she may be lost. My parents wouldn't be happy if I left her out here. I had to find her. I kept running and calling for her, but she wasn't answering. After calling out a few more times, I stopped running. I realized that I was pretty far past any point I could remember. I started trying to trace my steps back and quickly realized that I was lost. I can remember this cold hitting me as I realized that I had no idea which way led back to the trail. It wasn't long before I heard my name again, only this time it was closer, and almost a whisper. I spun around looking frantically. The voice was wrong. It sounded like my sister, but it definitely wasn't her voice that I was hearing. I could hear something moving just out of my sight, and my hair stood on end. It didn't take long for me to make out the creature that was watching me. I heard my name again and looked right where it came from. I could make out this human shape, but it was all wrong. It was on all fours, kind of hunched over. It had a pelt of some type and an animal skull over its head. But the eyes were wrong. They were too human to be an animal. I screamed and it smiled, lunging towards me. I turned and ran like my life depended on it, because as far as I was concerned, it did. This thing was fast and I knew it was toying with me. I was panting and my body burned, but I wasn't stopping. Finally, I saw the trees thinning out in front of me, and I wasted no time in making it out of the trees. I could hear whatever it was calling my name from the tree line as I hurried to untie my horse. I ignored the calls and threw myself into the saddle. My mare needed absolutely no encouragement to get out of there. We were soon racing down the trail as whatever it was followed us in the trees. My heart was racing and my palms were sweaty. As we rounded the corner and the house was visible, we didn't stop running. My mare was wide-eyed and terrified. I couldn't blame her. I knew that whatever it was had just followed us home. I rushed to my dad and told him what had happened, yelling for him to get his gun. He looked startled at first, but when he saw how scared I was, he met me at the gate, opening it quickly with his shotgun in hand. Whatever it was chasing me, it stayed in the trees. Dad shook his head as I told him what had happened. He knew that I knew better. I had been warned my whole life, but I didn't believe the warnings or the stories. After that, no one was allowed to check on the fence alone. We had to go in pairs. Don't be like me. Pay attention. These warnings may just save your life. Hi, Donovan. I've been looking for other people who might believe what I'm talking about. There are groups on the internet, and I've talked with people, but honestly, it all sounds made up to me, which doesn't help my confidence when I share this, but I think this is the place to tell my story. My wife had been bugging me for a few weeks. She asked me to set up security cameras on the perimeter of her home. She wanted a camera set up over the garage too. A few random things had been happening around our house for a couple of weeks, and my wife was pretty concerned. There were several nights when our trash can was moved. It was never knocked over or spilled, but it was moved across the yard. We have a fence and a gate that locks on the outside of our house. 3 nights in a row, the lock was unfastened and the gate was open. My wife saw our dog in the front yard. I tried to tell her it was just neighborhood kids, but she persisted that it wasn't. So I went out and I spent a bunch of money and bought all these security cameras. I work long days, so it took a lot of coffee to get acclimated to staying awake and watching the cameras. The first couple nights, nothing happened. I was beginning to think my wife was going crazy. Maybe she needed more sleep. I was trying not to doze off on the 4th night. It was a Saturday. It was late and I was awake because I didn't have to be at work early the next morning. First, I saw the camera in front of the garage blink out, and it went white for maybe a half a second. When the picture came back, our trash can was moved to the other side of the driveway. The camera on the side of the house turned off on its own. It just went black. I rewound the tape but saw the exact same thing I saw the first time. Just wait for a flash. I went outside to check it out. It was quiet out, which is totally normal at 2 a.m. where I live. It's a pretty quiet neighborhood. I saw nothing out of place, except for that trash can. I grabbed the handle of the trash can to drag it back to where it belongs, and pulled, but it didn't budge. I couldn't move the darn thing. It felt like it weighed a literal ton. I leaned back and pulled it with both hands. That thing wasn't moving. I stood there dumbfounded. The overhead lights on the garage flickered. I tried lifting the lid off the trash can just to do something. It was stuck. The trash can was completely immovable. The lights flickered again and turned off. Everything went black. I heard a loud buzzing for a second, and the lights flickered back to life. The trash can moved again. Now it was near the curb. I started freaking out. This whole thing was way too weird. I ran back inside the house and locked the door. I watched the yard through the window for maybe about an hour, and nothing happened at all. I sat in front of the computer screen and watched the cameras. I was buzzing. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to see. I didn't believe in ghosts, and I wasn't sure what could possibly be going on. The camera on the side of the house was still black. I kept glancing at it anyway, then it turned on. The gate was open, and I saw my dog standing there. I forgot that I had let him out just a few minutes earlier. He was looking at something. I saw him raise his hackles like he was scared. Then both cameras turned off again, and the screens were dead. I got up and ran to the garage and opened the automatic door. My dog heard and ran to me. He was whimpering and his tail was between his legs. I was patting him on the head when I saw something move alongside the front yard. It was smallish and fast. For a second, I thought it was a cat or something, but it couldn't be. It had pale skin. I only saw it for a second, but I was sure. My dog whimpered and bolted in the house. The lights above the garage flickered again. I flipped on the switch to the lights inside the garage, but they didn't respond, and it went dark again. That buzzing sound returned and changed into this low hum. My eyes were adjusting to the dark, and I saw something in the shadows near the street. It was a short, pale kid. That's what I thought at first as it started moving towards me. I saw that its head was bulbous. It was too big to be a kid. It opened its eyes and revealed these large black orbs, and it blinked several times. The lights flickered again, and when they turned off, I heard this squealing noise, like someone was burning rubber in their car, but there was no smell. Right as the lights came back on, I saw my trash can pop up and then blast straight into the air, and the whole thing was completely silent. I ran into the driveway and looked up, but the trash can was gone. It disappeared. And so did the little person or whatever it was that I saw. I just stood there and looked up at the sky for a long time. I locked the side gate, and even though it felt completely pointless, I went inside and I checked the cameras. I saw nothing in the side yard camera. It had blacked out, but the camera in the front of the garage was working. I rewound the footage. The trash can was sitting there. The lights above the garage flickered, and the screen went white, and when it came back, I was standing in the driveway and the trash can was gone. I kept rewatching it over and over, looking for anything, a pale person or those giant black eyes, but there was nothing there. My wife was right to suspect something, but I still don't know how to explain any of it. I don't scare easy. Maybe that's my ego talking, but I like to think it's the truth. The military humbles you, but it also teaches you what you're capable of. It teaches when fear is and isn't appropriate. 3 weeks ago, my fear was very appropriate. Unless I dreamt the entire day, there's no explanation for what I saw. There's at least no explanation that makes any sense. I've gone hunting every season since I retired from the military. That's 10 years now. Deer, boars, elk. I've been up and down the food chain. I eat what I kill. I'm not a trophy hunter. You might not even know I was a hunter if you just came by my place some random afternoon. I don't keep gun magazines on the coffee table. My gun closet is tucked away in the garage, safely away from the eyes and the hands of visitors. I don't talk about hunting. It's my personal time. Out there away from civilization with a rifle in my hands, it can be a comforting feeling. For better or for worse, the experience is calming. Usually. 3 weeks ago, calm was thrown out the window. I had recently moved my deer tower from its usual spot in the Okanagan forest. I set it up about 30 kilometers northwest. My only motivation was the change in scenery. In hindsight, that might not have been a good enough reason. Something found me out there. Despite all the camouflage and the concealment, something picked up my scent off the wind and came right to me. It hunted me like a fox on a hen. I was sitting in my little hen house, all warm and unprepared. It expected me to be an easy meal, I'm sure. If I'd been any less lucky that day, I probably would have been. I didn't hear it coming. That's embarrassing, but I really didn't. I only saw it when it breached the tree line and sulked into the clearing. It was massive. I thought at first it was a bear. Its fur was just too long, too thick and wild. When I aimed my gun in its direction, I saw the beast for what it was. A wolf, I think. A wolf larger than any animal I've ever seen in North America. It was looking at me and drooling. Starving, I could tell. I was shocked. I was appropriately afraid, I think. My rifle was not the caliber designed to take out animals of that magnitude. It kept coming toward the deer tower. I slid my finger onto the trigger, just in case I'd have to shoot to keep the beast moving. The base of my tower was 10 feet off the ground. When that thing got close and stood on its hind legs, its front claws scraped the corner of the floor. I shot it. And it didn't flinch. It roared and sighed, almost annoyed, and it mauled the tree tower itself. It could have jumped up there, I bet. It could have joined me in the box and had me cornered. I don't know why it didn't. Maybe it was just playing with me. Maybe I pissed it off and it wanted to piss me off right back. It tore through the legs in seconds. The next thing I knew, the entire structure was collapsing. The floor fell from beneath my feet and I went tumbling with it. I hit the ground hard. I lost my breath. Most of the tower collapsed right on the top of the wolf, or the dog, or bear, or whatever that thing was. I still don't know what it was. The weight of the tower knocked it down. It disoriented it. The bottle of doe urine I had with me busted open. The scent must have hit that animal like a whirlwind. It thrashed and splintered the remains of the stand and gave me just enough time to run. I made it to the tree line with my rifle in hand. I knew I couldn't outrun it. It was only a matter of time before it landed on my scent yet again. I turned around and used the side of a tree to steady my aim. I was still pretty shaken from the fall. I waited. I held my breath and I just waited. I watched this wolf thing rake its claws through the earth, searching for the source of the burning odor. When its paws came back up empty, it started to look around. I watched it as it stood up again and realized a horrifying truth. Its body just sat naturally upright as it did on all fours. It didn't struggle to hold its balance at all. It spotted me again. It huffed and it stepped toward me, this time walking on 2 legs. Luck found me again in that moment. If the wolf hadn't stood up, I would have been aiming at its shoulders and its back. On its hind legs, though, I could get to its stomach. I could get to somewhere important. When I fired this time, it yelped. I screamed with every ounce of air in my lungs. I screamed until I was empty. It must have been enough. I watched the wolf turn and flee in the other direction. I waited again. I knew I had to. I had to make sure that it wasn't circling around me, trying to approach me from the flank. It took me 10 hours to make it back to my car. Every sound and movement put me on edge. I don't scare easy. I didn't used to anyway. The more time that passes between that encounter and now, the more I want to know what that animal was. I tell you one thing though, I'm not willing to go back and get those answers. I'm built for a lot of things, but hunting that isn't one of them. I can take my rifle anywhere else in the world. That monster can have that forest. Hi, Donovan. I kind of hesitate to tell this story. I mean, police officers seem to get a bad rap no matter what we do these days. I don't want to be known as some delusional city employee who imagines things, but I guess if I stay anonymous, it's fine. I work in law enforcement in a small city in Kansas. I've been on the force for a good 15 years. One morning, my partner and I responded to a call of a possible burglary in an older area of town not far from the station. We got there and scouted around the perimeter briefly before knocking on the front door. The elderly lady living there alone was terrified. She didn't open the door, but she stuck her head out of an upstairs window. She said she was too afraid to navigate through her house to open the front door for us. She told us where we could find the key hidden in her yard. As we were communicating with her, we kept looking around for any sign of trouble. There didn't appear to be any sign of a forced entry. The home had a front gate, and everything appeared secure. We got inside and did a quick walkthrough of the upstairs. The woman spoke with us from her bedroom doorway. She would only open the door halfway and said she was staying put in her room. We got her name and details. She told us that she had been sitting in her chair when suddenly she started hearing banging on the interior door leading down into the garage. Many of the homes in that area are in a row house set up on each block. The garages are on the ground floor with the residents on the floor above. A lot of these houses have areas downstairs offset from the garage that are often used as in-law rental units. At this moment in my story, we had only checked out the upstairs residence and had not yet accessed the garage downstairs. She said she had initially gone downstairs, but the door handle started rattling. She described the banging as being incredibly loud, as if someone was kicking in the door, and the door handle was shaking violently. She became terrified at the thought that someone had gotten into the garage and was trying to break into her residence. She had called 911, and my partner and I showed up. When we had this info, we asked for another unit to begin making its way toward our location. We pulled out our weapons and flashlights and swept the upstairs area more thoroughly. We went downstairs to investigate the quarters on the lower level. We opened the door and descended into the dark downstairs. All the curtains were closed and barely any sunlight was getting in. When we got some lights on, it was like a time capsule in there. The entire downstairs area was like stepping into the 1970s. There was lots of dust, but otherwise perfectly preserved food and alcohol, books and magazines, and etc. When we stepped into the garage, we found that the automatic garage door was no longer operational, and a large old pristine Buick sat there looking like it never had left the lot. We found a closed door in the back, and it led us to an old unused in-law unit with vintage furniture and appliances. The place made us feel that we had totally stepped back in time. When we stepped into the unit's bedroom, it looked like someone had gotten up, walked out to do some errands, and never came back. There were some personal items, combs, brushes, makeup, and jewelry on the dresser. The closet was full of old suits, hats, and dresses. We searched in every conceivable place for a person to be hiding, and we could find nothing suspicious. All the entrances and windows were locked and secure. I'd been to many burglaries and many home invasions, and I've never seen a place with no sign at all of an intruder. There were no footprints, and the dust wasn't disturbed. There were framed black and white photos and documents on the walls. One of them was a headshot of the lady we had met upstairs. I took a closer look, and to the right of her photo, there was a frame containing a birth certificate and a death certificate. The woman's name was on both, the same name that belonged to the woman upstairs. Next to her photo was a framed photo of an elderly man, and also his birth and death certificates hanging on the wall. At that point, every hair on the back of my neck was standing straight up. When my partner saw the documents, we both just stared at each other, and then we ran back upstairs straight to the room where we had spoken to her. The door was closed, and when we knocked on it, she didn't open it. We went into the room and it was completely empty. Nobody and nothing was in there. Just an empty, old, dusty room. We looked everywhere and found no sign of anybody. At that point, we canceled the other responding unit and went back to the station. Come to find out, the woman and her husband had been murdered in that house 30 years prior. Her son had been unable to move on from the event and had left the house like some kind of museum. As my partner and I left the station later and got back into our car, he just said, "I don't know, man. Do you believe in ghosts?" That was pretty much the end of that conversation. But this incident really sticks with me. She had seemed completely real, flesh and blood. If she wasn't real, how could she call 911? How could we have stood and talked to her face to face? It all just seems impossible and makes me question everything. I was a volunteer firefighter for a tiny Midwestern town. We would do fire safety demonstrations at our local schools and certain companies in town, but we rarely had an emergency call. In fact, I only remember 3 fire calls in town over my 15 years on the job. Fortunately, or maybe unfortunately, we were a suburb of a decently large city, so that kept us busy. We got a call in the middle of the week, about 11 at night, that there was a fire at the new town hall. Luckily, no one was inside at the time, and the only thing lost was the building. Our town had just approved plans for a new town hall and had begun building only a month ago, so it wasn't finished yet. The lot for the new town hall wasn't exactly in town. There was a natural area with prairies and woods between the downtown and the suburbs. The new town hall was built on a flat area that backed up to a marshland. It was either that or they would have to clear a bunch of trees in a wooded area. The marsh was small and flooded sometimes in the spring, but the water never got anywhere close to the spot they were building on. One of the consequences of the town hall being there was that no one noticed it burning. There were no houses in the immediate area, but I heard there had been plans to clear the forest at some point and develop it. I doubt the plan is still in the works though. The fire was called in by a young man driving home along the road. It couldn't have been more than 15 minutes from the time we got the call to when we arrived, but the building was completely destroyed already. We beat the sheriff there by a good 10 minutes. We got the fire out pretty quickly considering. I'd estimate it had been burning for quite a while before we arrived. The only thing salvageable from the building was the cement slab. The sheriff wanted to start an investigation. None of the wilderness areas around the building suffered any damage. It was localized to the town hall. There was no gas or electricity to the building yet, and the workers had been using portable generators. They kept the generators locked up in their trailers overnight, so that really wasn't a likely cause of the fire. We assumed it was likely arson, but there wasn't anyone in town that had any reason to burn down the new town hall. The vote for the new town hall passed unanimously. The building had just begun construction, so all the records were still being stored at the old town hall, which rules out anyone trying to destroy documents. It was a very strange case. This was the type of thing that happened in the city, not our small town, but it gets even stranger. The kid who had called it in stayed there and waited for the sheriff. He said he saw a man in a cape hanging around outside of the building when it was burning. He described the person about 6 feet tall and wearing what looked like to be a black cape. He couldn't see the face at all, but he said they had glowing red eyes. Both the sheriff and I looked at each other and tried to refrain from laughing. A man in a cape with glowing red eyes? Is Dracula our arsonist? I couldn't believe it. The sheriff asked the kid to take a drug test. He agreed and was still adamant that his story was true, that there was a man out there with glowing red eyes, and he last saw him heading towards the marsh. I helped the sheriff rope off the property with caution tape. He decided to start the investigation in the morning when it was light out. As we were making our way around the back of the building, the sheriff noticed footprints in the dirt. I wouldn't have seen them in such dim lighting, but maybe that's why I'm not the county sheriff. I told him they were probably our footprints, since we had been around the outside of the building to put the fire out. But he stopped me and said, "These definitely aren't yours." Maybe that kid did actually see somebody, but that begs the question, who on earth is out here in bare feet and dressed in a cape setting things on fire. The sheriff tried to get some photos, but they weren't showing up, even with the flash. We looked at the camera and it was just a blur. Now, I don't know what made both of us turn around and look towards the marsh, but we both did at the exact same time. I can't explain it, but it's like we both just knew something was out there, and something was, in fact, out there. I understood why the kid described the person as wearing a cape. If you didn't see him that well, you would have thought it would have been a long cape wrapped around his arms. But there was a full moon that night, and it gave the sheriff and I enough light to see that it was no cape. Those were wings. They were like bat wings, no feathers, and its eyes were definitely red. The sheriff yelled out to the creature, but as soon as he did, it disappeared into the marsh. He and I both stood there with our eyes fixed on the marsh for I don't know how long before I finally spoke. "Are you going to go after it?" I asked. The sheriff said, "Hell no." And that was the end of our conversation. The final results of the investigation were inconclusive, but I know that thing started the fire. I figure that must have been its land or something. The new town hall was moved to another area, and we never had any more problems. Hi, Donovan. I've been listening to your show for a while now, and I'm finally writing in with me and Goldie's story. It's just as much as her story as it is mine. See, Goldie is a golden retriever who's been with our family for over 5 years now, and she loves to go camping with us. I have a travel trailer that I use quite a bit. Almost every weekend in the summer, my son and my wife and I are camping at some campground. We live in Ohio, but we do go all over to camp. This one weekend in June, we didn't travel too far, and we camped at Mohican State Park. It was the second day that I was there. I was taking Goldie for a walk along the river trail. We had been walking for about 30 minutes when I heard something from off the trail come barreling through the woods. I thought it was a deer or possibly a black bear, but then it stops, like it must have caught wind of us or something. Goldie steps out in front of me and starts doing this low growl at the woods. She sensed that something was off right away, and the motion from this thing startled her at first. And I'm standing there and I can't see anything because the woods are pretty thick in that area. I started to pull at her lead, signaling to her that we need to turn around and go back, but she wouldn't budge. Then I start to hear this thing coming out of the woods. It's slowly making its way to the trail. I start yelling in case it's a bear, saying, "Get out of here, bear." But what happened next shocked me to my core. I'm yelling and Goldie is there growling like I've never seen her before. She's such a mild-mannered dog and a total sweetheart. This monstrous, and I mean monstrous figure comes walking out of the woods making all kinds of noises while it's walking. Twigs and branches are snapping all over the place. It's covered in this long dark fur from head to toe, except for its face. And it stares right at me with its beady eyes and it raises its one hand. Now, I'm not sure what it was doing, but it put its arm over its head and it stood there making this grunting sound. Goldie at this point is going nuts. She's barking her head off, and it seems like this thing is annoyed at all the barking and starts to cover its ears. I'm trying to hold on to the lead as best as I can because Goldie just won't stop. This giant beast looks at Goldie and then turns and goes back into the woods. She wouldn't leave for another minute or so because I think she wanted to make sure the threat was gone. We eventually get back to camp and I tell my wife and my kid about the entire experience. It was crazy to say the least. We ended up going home later that afternoon. I did tell one of the local rangers about the incident, but I think he just passed it off as a black bear. That thing was a Sasquatch. I have no doubt in my mind, and my sweet girl saved me from whatever that thing intended to do. I've been down on my luck plenty of times, and I've learned to never look down on people. I've been the guy on the side of the road with my thumb sticking out as cars drive on by. That's why I decided to stop that night, because I knew how he must have been feeling. I really wish I hadn't. I was on my way home from Harrisburg, heading back to Philly. I know most of the state like the back of my hand, having spent a few years as a short-range delivery driver. So when I hit the stalled traffic caused by all the road work, I knew what back streets and alternate routes I could turn to. It was one of those lesser-traveled roads that I encountered the man. He was slowly walking down the shoulder, thumb hung lazily in the air. At first, I drove past him. Despite what I said about the looking down on people thing, I was a little bit hesitant to let somebody in my car right then. There really wasn't a whole lot around, and I couldn't imagine where he was heading to or coming from. But the angel on my shoulder won the battle, and after about a mile, I made a U-turn and I pulled up alongside him. I could see through my rolled-down window that he was a middle-aged guy, clean-shaven with his short cropped brown hair. He was wearing jeans and a denim jacket and had a thick rucksack flung over one shoulder. He was holding something small and flat in the crook of his elbow, but I couldn't make out what it was. He seemed alarmed when I first pulled up. I guess he wasn't really expecting anyone to pick him up from the side of the road. I introduced myself through the window and let him know which direction I was headed, and told him he could ride with me if he wanted to. He hesitated at first, but quickly decided that it beat walking alone on a dark road in the dead of night. He opened the door and climbed in. He introduced himself as Ken, and Ken smelled absolutely wretched. I wasn't sure how long he had been on the road, and knew that a few days without a shower can really do a number on anyone. Not wanting to make him feel self-conscious, I just kept the windows rolled down and made some small talk. He didn't really go into details on where he was going. He said that he had family in the Northeast, and that he had set out a few days ago to make the trek. I had known plenty of guys with hobo-ish tendencies, and even had some myself. Despite all the urban legends, they usually weren't that bad. Some were even a good time to be around. They just kind of lacked guidance and ambition. And talking to Ken, it seemed like he fell short on both. After about maybe a half hour of driving down the nearly deserted road, I asked him about the thing he was carrying. He had placed it on his lap and was covering it with his hands. He became uneasy, so I dropped it. At one point, though, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. Not a light, but rather a dark shape right behind the car. I asked Ken if he saw it. He said no, but when I peeked over at him, I could see that some of the color had drained from his face. I didn't see it again until we continued on in silence, until a short while later when I had to answer nature's call. I pulled over to the side of the road and told Kent that I would be right back. He was a nice enough guy, but I took the keys with me anyway. When I went to get out of the car, Ken grabbed me by the arm and asked me to please not take long. He wasn't rough, but something in his voice struck me as odd. It sounded like fear, almost panic even. I assured him I would be quick and walked about 30 yards away up to the tree line. I had just started to do my business when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something darting from the wood line towards my car. Whatever it was moving pretty fast. Two more formless shadows followed it an instant later. Then another one on my left. This all happened in the span of about 2 seconds, and before I could zip up and turn around, I heard a scream from behind me coming from my car. I spun around and was caught with a bizarre spectacle. Those darting figures were now running in a full circle around my car. The shadows weren't anything material, and in fact, even seemed to grow and shrink in size and shape. Ken locked eyes with me through the open window, staring at me in dead silence. I had the keys in my pocket, and there was no way for him to roll it up. I was too in awe of what I was seeing to make any kind of rational decision. The forms just kept racing and racing around my car, a blur of erratic shapes. Suddenly, one of the shadows dove through the window, and Ken started screaming. He had been wearing a seatbelt, and I was close enough to hear his bone shattering The blurred form seemed to have Ken by the legs and started dragging him across the road. All the other shapes now converged with the one carrying Ken. The thing underwent some kind of sick transformation, taking on the full mass of all the combined shadows. The end result was this massive creature, probably 12 feet, if not more. It had defined legs and arms now. One hand wrapped around Ken's legs. The head seemed to be in the shape of a bull, an immense rack of antlers crowning its head. The beast moved quickly into the forest on the far side of the road. I could hear Ken's screams for some time before they faded away. I was trying to contain my terror. I realized that my entire body was shaking so violently that I cracked a tooth. I stumbled over to my car, resting against the passenger side door, and trying to decipher what in the hell just happened. I happened to be looking down through the open window, and on the floor beneath, where Ken had been sitting, there was a book. There were strange symbols on the cover, one I recognized as a pentagram. I flipped through the book and felt bile start to rise in my throat. I couldn't understand any of the writing. It was in a language I had never seen before, and it certainly wasn't Latin. The sickening part was that the ink appeared to be dried blood in some parts. Other parts actually seemed to have been written with human fecal matter. I dropped the book to the ground and ran around to my driver's side door. Before I got in though, I caught the sight of Ken's rucksack sitting in the back seat. With trepidation, I removed it and untied the flap. The bag was filled with the remains of, well, I don't know what. There were bones with meat and flesh still attached. And while I tried to tell myself that none of it was human, a part of me knew that it was. I threw the bag onto the grass as far as I could. I got in my car and drove full speed down the road, not looking back once. I never went to the police. What was I going to tell them? I picked up a hitchhiker and a demon carried him off into the woods, and I threw out his bag of human remains. That was probably an easy way to end up on a watch list somewhere. No, I didn't do anything at all. Ken, or whoever he was obviously mixed up in some kind of dark and evil affair, one which I wanted no part of. Whatever it was that night, it left me well enough alone, and I plan on keeping that way. I'm only telling this story so it can serve as a warning. Be careful who you stop for when driving down dark and lonely roads. I was a teenager, and I was still in high school. Occasionally, my mom and I would drive around for hours to places that we didn't even know about, just aimlessly driving to some place that would get us away from everything. We found many cool areas doing this. Now, the reason for it wasn't very pleasant. I'd rather not go into details about it, but at least we have the memories we do. It was a particularly bad day. My mom picks me up from school. She got to leave work early, and she says that we were going for another drive. I never complained because I knew my mom was dealing with enough already, so I did everything I could to make her happy. That meant smiling and sucking it up. It also meant never complaining about spending too much time in the car. I did have siblings, but they were always with their friends. I had friends, but none that I really hung out with outside of school. I suppose I was more of a lone wolf than a social type. This meant that I was Mom's only company during the tougher days, and I knew how much that meant to her. It meant a lot to me too. As we were driving, the sky gets pretty gray. It looked like we were going to be driving in the rain, and I was okay with that. My mom was driving some time before I realized that we were in the foothills, and from this area, we started heading up towards the mountains. We hadn't been to this area before. It was pretty cool. It was very green, and the road was full of all sorts of crazy twists and turns. My mom liked driving on roads like that. It made her feel invincible, I think. There's a point in time when we get to a flat area. I assumed it was the very top of this mountain. There's a road that leads straight ahead, but there's these weird gates. They sort of reminded me of those railroad gates that can open and close. They happened to be open, It looked really weird, but we were both very curious about it, so we went in. There were a few huge metal boxes that looked like transformers or something. I figured they were somehow connected to the gate that we drove through. All around us is this really cool wooded area. We followed the road for some time. Eventually, we hit a dead end. At the end of the road was this enormous body of water. It looked like a lake, but it seemed to turn into rivers that led off into two different directions. It seemed peaceful, and that's what my mom needed. We climbed out of the car and started to walk around this small area of land. If you were looking at the body of water from our car, there were different elements to notice. The first being that the area of land that we stood on obviously wrapped around the lake, but it was weird because we both couldn't walk on any of the sides. We were stuck in the dead center of the lake. This was partly due to the area on the left and the right of us being very steep and covered in rocks. There were two river type things, as I mentioned, but they sort of swerved out to the northeast and northwest. It created this V shape almost. And then dead ahead of us was another area of land that was pretty far away from us. It was an interesting area for sure. I hadn't seen anything like it before. It was the most pure silence I've ever heard in my whole life. No cars, no background noise. But there weren't any other noises either, which made it kind of eerie. We were out in nature, but we couldn't hear any signs of it, like birds or crickets or any flying insects. It was dead quiet. It started to sprinkle the tiniest bit of rain, and even that sound seemed amplified. I remember my mom saying, "This is weird, huh?" It really was very weird, and I didn't think it could get much weirder, but it did. We looked out into the body of water and watched the small raindrops hitting the surface. The surface of the lake was super still, like freakily still. Like I've never seen water so still, not even in a bathtub. So that's what made what we saw much more horrifying. As we looked out towards this body of water, we saw something rather large splash the water upwards. The sound alone was enough to frighten me. A loud splash after hearing nothing for several minutes was quite shocking, but the enormity of whatever forced the water up was unexplainable. I don't think it could have been a fish. If it was, that fish was humongous. I hadn't noticed prior, but I noticed at this point that there was this weird series of smaller objects sitting above the water off to my left. They almost looked like a row of rocks peeking out of the water. It must have not caught my eye before, being that the sides were pretty much covered by large rocks. But as soon as we saw that splash and the gigantic ripples it created in the lake, I started to wonder if those rocks weren't really rocks at all, but the back of something large hidden under the water. All of this observation took no time at all, and if I'm being truthful, I was much too frightened to stand there much longer. My mom started to usher me into the car, saying that we needed to leave, so we got into the car and left. I would have thought that my mind was playing tricks on me. All of what we had experienced was truly, for lack of better words, creepy. And my mom started revisiting the events out loud as we drove. Everything she was saying was exactly what I saw too. I can still hear her words. That wasn't a fish. It couldn't have been, right? All I know is whatever it was made me so scared. I wouldn't step foot near another lake or river again. I just won't.